States and Israel.
And I think Israel is especially lucky that AIPAC exists in this country.
Members of AIPAC are marching with us like a pillar of fire.
AIPAC's continued support is more important now than ever before.
Together with you, we can secure a strong Jewish people, a strong state of Israel.
On behalf of the state of Israel,
I thank you for being our partners.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome former AIPAC President Bernice Manicherian.
From the moment of its birth, one friend has stood at Israel's side, present in moments of great uncertainty, sharing in hours of triumph. For 6 decades, our nation's leaders have worked to secure and strengthen a friendship built upon common values and a shared vision of the future. A relationship that has been built to last. Good morning and welcome to the largest and most exciting policy conference ever. We are more than 7,500 strong. Representing every state in the Union and more than 1,200 students from 365 college campuses nationwide. We are Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, Christians and Jews, black and white, all political activists. And with us today are international friends, more than 100 delegates from 15 countries. Also joining us are pastors from across the countries and rabbis who have led their congregants to be with us at this historic time. Please join me in recognizing the phenomenal leadership of 4 rabbis in particular who brought with them 100 or more of their congregants. Rabbis David Wolpe, Ellie Hersher, Joseph Kratkoff, and Ed Feinstein. That's leadership. And leadership is what AIPAC and this conference are all about. We gather here in our nation's capital to stand as one community united by our common commitment to a strong U.S.-Israel friendship. For the next 3 days, we will explore the many issues shaping America and Israel's future. We will meet modern-day heroes who have made the dream of Eretz Israel a reality. And we will hear from the committed American men and women who are working to ensure the strength and the vitality of the U.S.-Israel alliance will continue. And we will also welcome home the leadership of Congress, just days since they returned from a very special trip to Israel. We will host Israel's Prime Minister, and we will also hear addresses from three names that dominate the headlines, the airwaves, the TV screens: Clinton, McCain, and Obama. Most importantly, we will act. We will meet with our members of Congress on Wednesday to strengthen the friendships that are so crucial to our work. And as always, AIPAC and this conference are illustrative of the strong bipartisan American support for Israel. It is in that spirit that we will greet all of our honored speakers with respect and dignity, remembering that they are all our friends and guests in our home. To each of you, thank you for being here and for all that you do to continue to ensure that today and always the U.S.-Israel relationship remains an alliance that is built to last. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome AIPAC board member Ron Barnes.
Throughout this year's AIPAC Policy Conference, we will have the opportunity to hear from all three presidential candidates. Today, I have the distinct honor of introducing the first, a man who knows our community well. He has spoken twice before at the AIPAC Policy Conference, and he and his wife, Cindy, graciously opened their Phoenix home to host a dinner for AIPAC National Summit attendees. John McCain is a solid friend, a senator from my state, he is a senator from my state and the presumptive Republican nominee for president. Whenever I get together with Senator McCain, we pretty much talk about two things, and two things only: the Arizona Diamondbacks baseball team and Israel. Believe me when I tell you that when it comes to both topics, he is well informed, he is passionate, and he is absolutely unflinching in his support. While we share those two interests, Senator McCain understands better than most that at the end of the day, baseball is just a game, while the complex issues affecting Israel are matters of U.S. national security. Put simply, Senator McCain has never failed to be there for Israel. From his very first day in Congress, he has been on the right side of every single vote impacting our ally. He recognizes the vital role that American assistance to Israel plays in helping to secure the Jewish state, and he has been a consistent supporter of the foreign aid bill. During his more than 2 decades as a senior member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, John McCain has been a leader in promoting cooperation with America's allies and has ardently backed cooperation between the IDF and our military. And when it comes to the global dangers of a nuclear Iran, Senator McCain has made it clear that he understands that Iran is not just a threat to Israel, but a threat to the United States as well. "16 years ago, John McCain stepped up to the plate to assert American leadership in this battle when he authored landmark legislation opposing Iran's efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. Senator McCain knows firsthand the high costs of war and the terrible agonies of being held prisoner. He has made himself available to the families of all Israeli POWs and MIAs, and he has made countless efforts to help bring them home. On a recent trip to Israel, John visited Sderot, a town which the State Department has warned members of Congress to avoid. He made the decision to go anyway, because he wanted to meet the people for whom life under fire is a daily reality. After looking those people in the eye and bearing witness to the terror that Hamas rains down on them, he said, and I quote, "No nation in the world can be attacked incessantly without responding. The fact is that I come from a border state, and if people were rocketing my state, I think that the citizens from my state would advocate a very vigorous response." Senator John McCain is a proven leader and a true believer in the values of freedom and democracy shared by the United States and Israel. He is someone who deeply values Israel and who understands that strengthening America's relationship with the Jewish state is essential in pursuing what's best for America. Please join me in welcoming the presumptive Republican nominee for President, Senator John McCain.
Kind welcome, and thank you, Ron, for your generous remarks and the invitation to address you. I see that we have some students here, including a few from Arizona, and I welcome you to Washington and your money. And it's a pleasure, as always, to be in the company of the men and women of the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee. And I know that all of us are proud to be in the company of my dear and beloved distinguished senator from the state of Connecticut, my dear friend Joe Lieberman. Joe, thank you. A man of humility, a man of kindness, and a great and dear friend, not only of America, my family, the state of Israel, and the world. My friends, all of you involved in the work of AIPAC have taken up a great and vital cause, and a cause set firmly in the American heart. When President Truman recognized the new state of Israel 60 years ago, he acted on the highest ideals and best instincts of our country. He was a man with courage and a sense of history, and he surely knew what great challenges the Jewish state would face in its early years. To his lasting credit, he resolved that the people of Israel would not face them alone, because they would always have a friend and ally in the United States of America. The cause of Israel and of our common security has always depended on men and women of courage, and I've been lucky enough to know quite a few of them. I think often of one in particular, the late Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. I got to know Senator Jackson when I was the Navy liaison officer to the United States Senate. In 1979, I traveled with him to Israel, where I knew he was considered a hero. But I had no idea just how admired he was until we landed in the airport in Tel Aviv to find a crowd of 700 or 800 Israelis calling out his name. waving signs that read, "God bless you, Scoop," and "Senator Jackson, thank you." Scoop Jackson had the special respect of the Jewish people, the kind of respect accorded to brave and faithful friends. He was and remains the model of what an American statesman should be. The people of Israel reserve a special respect for courage because so much courage has been required of them. In the record of history, sheer survival in the face of Israel's many trials would have been impressive enough. But Israel has achieved much more than that these past 60 years. Israel has endured and thrived, and her people have built a nation that's an inspiration to free nations everywhere. Yet no matter how successful the nation of Israel, or how far removed from the Holocaust, there are experiences that will never pass from memory. Not long ago, I was in Jerusalem with Senator Lieberman and our colleague Lindsey Graham, and we went to the Holocaust Memorial, Yad Vashem. And for all the boundless examples of cruelty and inhumanity to be found there, for all the pain and grief remembered there, somehow I was especially moved by the story of the camp survivors who died from the very nourishment given to them by their liberators. They'd starved and suffered so much that their bodies were too weak even for food. They endured it all, only to die at the moment of their deliverance. These are the kinds of experiences that the Jewish people carry in memory, and they are far from the worst experiences of the Holocaust. These are the kind of griefs and afflictions from which the state of Israel offered escape. And today, when we join in saying never again, that is not a wish, a request, or a plea to the enemies of Israel. It is a promise that the United States and Israel will honor against any enemy. Against any enemy. Against any enemy who cares to test us. The threats to Israel's security are large and growing, and America's commitment must grow as well. I strongly support the increase in military aid to Israel scheduled to begin in October. I am committed to making certain Israel maintains its qualitative military edge. Israel's enemies are too numerous. Israel's enemies are too numerous, its margin of error too small, and our shared interests and values too great for us to follow any other policy. Foremost in all our minds is the threat posed by the regime in Tehran. The Iranian president has called for Israel to be wiped off the map and suggested that Israel's Jewish population should return to Europe. He calls Israel a stinking corpse, that it's on its way to annihilation. But the Iranian leadership does far more than issue vile insults. It acts in ways directly detrimental to the security of Israel and the United States. A sponsor of both Hamas and Hezbollah, the leadership of Iran has repeatedly used violence to undermine Israel in the Middle East peace process. It has trained, financed, and equipped extremists in Iraq who have killed American soldiers fighting to bring freedom to that country. It remains the world's chief sponsor of terrorism and threatens to destabilize the entire Middle East from Basra to Beirut. Tehran's continued pursuit of nuclear weapons poses an unacceptable risk, a danger we cannot allow. Emboldened by nuclear weapons, Iran would feel free to sponsor terrorist attacks against any perceived enemy. Its flouting of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty would render that agreement obsolete and could induce Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and others to join a nuclear arms race. The world would have to live indefinitely with the possibility that Tehran might pass nuclear materials or weapons to one of its allied terrorist networks. Armed as well with its ballistic missile arsenal, an Iranian nuclear bomb would pose an existential threat to the people of Israel. European negotiators have proposed a peaceful endgame for Tehran should it abandon its nuclear ambitions and comply with UN Security Council resolutions. The plan offers far-reaching economic incentives, external support for a civilian nuclear energy program, and integration into the international community. But Tehran has said no. The Iranians have spent years working toward a nuclear program, and the idea that they now seek nuclear weapons because we refuse to engage in presidential-level talks is a serious misreading of history. In reality, a series of administrations have tried to talk to Iran, and none tried harder than the Clinton administration. In 1998, the Secretary of State made a public overture to the Iranians, laid out a roadmap to normal relations, and for 2 years tried to engage. The Clinton administration even lifted some sanctions, and Secretary Albright apologized for American actions going back to the 1950s. But even under President Khatami, a man, by all accounts, less radical than the current president, Iran rejected these overtures. Even so, we hear talk of a meeting with the Iranian leadership offered up as if it were some sudden inspiration, a bold new idea that somehow nobody has ever thought of before. Yet it's hard to see what such a summit with President Ahmadinejad would actually gain, except an earful of anti-Semitic rants and a worldwide audience for a man who denies one Holocaust and talks before frenzied crowds about starting another. Such a spectacle would harm Iranian moderates and dissidents as the radicals and hardliners strengthen their position and suddenly acquire the appearance of respectability. Rather than sitting down unconditionally with the Iranian president or supreme leader in the hope that we can talk sense into them, we must create the real world pressures that will peacefully but decisively change the path that they are on. Essential to this strategy is the UN Security Council, which should impose progressively tougher political and economic sanctions. Should the Security Council continue to delay in this responsibility, the United States must lead like-minded countries in imposing multilateral sanctions outside the UN framework. I'm proud to have been a leader on these issues for years, having co-authored the 1992 Iran-Iraq Arms Non-Proliferation Act. Over a year ago, I proposed applying sanctions to restrict Iran's ability to import refined petroleum products on which it is highly dependent. And the time has come for an international campaign to do just that. A severe limit on Iranian imports of gasoline would create immediate pressure on Khamenei and Ahmadinejad to change course and to cease in the pursuit of nuclear weapons. At the same time, we need the support of those in the region who are most concerned about Iran and of our European partners as well. They can help by imposing targeted sanctions that will impose a heavy cost on the regime's leaders, including the denial of visas and freezing of assets. As a further measure to contain and deter Iran, the United States should impose financial sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran, which aids in Iran's terrorism and weapons proliferation. We must apply the full force of law to prevent business dealings with Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. I was pleased to join Senators Lieberman and Kyle in backing an amendment calling for the designation of the Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization responsible for killing American troops in Iraq. Over 3/4 of the Senate supported this obvious step, but not Senator Obama. He opposed this resolution because its support for countering Iranian influence in Iraq was, he said, quote, a wrong message not only to the world, but also to the region. But here, too, he's mistaken. Holding Iran's influence in check and holding a terrorist organization accountable sends exactly the right message to Iran, to the region, and to the world. We should privatize the sanctions against Iran by launching a worldwide divestment campaign. As more people, businesses, pension funds, and financial institutions across the world divest from companies doing business with Iran, the radical elite who run that country will become even more unpopular than they are already. Years ago, the moral clarity and conviction of civilized nations came together in a divestment campaign against South Africa, helping to rid that nation of the evil of apartheid. In our day, we must use that same power and moral conviction against the regime in Iran and help to safeguard the people of Israel and the peace of the world. In all of this, we will not only be defending our own safety and welfare, but also the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people. They are a great and civilized people with little sympathy for the terrorists their leaders finance and no wish to threaten other nations with nuclear weapons. Iran's rulers would be very different if the people themselves had a choice in the matter, and American policy should always reflect their hopes for a freer and more just society. The same holds true for the Palestinian people, most of whom ask only for a better life in a less violent world. They are badly served by the terrorist-led group in charge of Gaza. This is a group that still refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist, refuses to denounce violence, and refuses to acknowledge prior peace commitments. They deliberately target Israeli civilians in an attempt to terrorize the Jewish population. They spread violence and hatred, and with every new bombing, they set back the cause of their own people. During my last visit to Israel in March, I saw for myself the work of Hamas in the town of Sderot, just across the border, as you know, from Gaza. I saw the houses that have been hit by Hamas rockets. In the face of injuries, death, and destruction, thousands of Israelis have had to flee. Many others have stayed to carry on as best they can. I visited the home of a man named Pinhas Amar, who lives with his disabled wife, Eliza, and their children. One day last year, the siren sounded again to alert the town to incoming rocket fire. The rest of the family found cover. Eliza, on the other side of the house, was knocked out of her wheelchair and struck by shrapnel. This occurred on December 17th, and from that day until the day of my visit, just some 3 months later, more than 1,000 rockets had struck Sderot. Today, siren warnings are commonplace. The elementary schools are surrounded by concrete shelters, and children walking the streets in costume for Purim celebrations did so in fear. No nation in the world would allow its population to be attacked so incessantly, to be killed and intimidated so mercilessly without responding. And the nation of Israel is no exception. Prime Minister Omer and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas are engaged in talks that all of us hope will yield progress toward peace. Yet while we encourage this process, we must also ensure that Israel's people can live in safety until there is a Palestinian leadership willing and able to deliver peace. A peace process that places faith in terrorists can never end in peace. And we do no favors to the Palestinian people by conferring approval upon the terrorist syndicate that has seized power in Gaza. Likewise, Israel's chance for enduring peace with Lebanon depends on Lebanese government that has a monopoly on authority within its country's borders. That means no independent militias, no Hezbollah fighters, no weapons and equipment flowing to Hezbollah. Hezbollah fighters recently took up arms against their fellow Lebanese, starting the worst internal fighting since the Civil War ended in 1990. In the process, they extracted an agreement for a new political arrangement in which Hezbollah and its allies can veto any cabinet decision. As a leader of Hezbollah often reminds us, this group's mission is the defeat of Israel. The international community needs to more fully empower our allies in Lebanon, not only with military aid, but also with the resources to undermine Hezbollah's appeal. Better schools, hospitals, roads, and power generation and the like. We simply cannot afford to cede Lebanon's future to Syria and Iran. And we have an additional task. In the summer of 2006, Hamas and Hezbollah kidnapped 3 young Israelis, Gilad Shalit, Eldad Regev, and Ehud Goldwasser. And they've held them ever since. I met with the families of 2 of these men in December 2006 and heard firsthand about their ordeal. I committed then to bring attention to their situation, to insist that the Geneva Conventions are observed and call for the swift release of these men. These men are being unlawfully held, and they must be set free and returned home to Israel. Another matter of great importance to the security of both America and Israel is Iraq. You would never know from listening to those who are still caught up in angry arguments over yesterday's options, but our troops in Iraq have made hard-won progress under General Petraeus' new strategy. And Iraqi political leaders have moved ahead, slowly and insufficiently, but forward nonetheless. Sectarian violence declined dramatically. Sunnis in Anbar province and throughout Iraq are cooperating in the fight against al-Qaeda and Shia extremist militias. No longer control Basra. The Maliki government and its forces are in charge. Al-Qaeda terrorists are on the run, and our troops are going to make sure that they never come back. It's worth recalling that America's progress in Iraq is a direct result of the new strategy that Senator Obama vehemently opposed. It was the strategy he predicted would fail when he voted to cut off funds for our forces in Iraq. He now says he intends to withdraw combat troops from Iraq, 1 to 2 brigades per month, until they're all removed. He will do so regardless of the conditions in Iraq, regardless of the consequences for our national security, regardless of Israel's security, and in disregard of the best advice of our commanders on the ground. This course would surely result in a catastrophe. If our troops are ordered to make a forced retreat, we risk all-out civil war, genocide, and a failed state in the heart of the Middle East. Al-Qaeda terrorists would rejoice in the defeat of the United States. Allowing a potential terrorist sanctuary would profoundly affect the security of the United States, Israel, and our other friends, and would invite further intervention from Iraq's neighbors, including a very much emboldened Iran. We must not let this happen. We must not leave the region to suffer chaos, terrorist violence, and a wider war. My friends, as the people of Israel know better than most, the safety of free people can never be taken for granted. And in a world full of dangers, Israel and the United States must always stand together. The state of Israel stands as a singular achievement in many ways, and not the least is its achievement as the great democracy of the Middle East. If there are ties between America and Israel that critics of our alliance have never understood, perhaps that's because they do not fully understand the love of liberty and the pursuit of justice. But they should know those ties cannot be broken. We were brought together by shared ideals and by shared adversity. We have been comrades in struggle and trusted partners in the quest for peace. We are the most natural of allies, and like Israel itself, that alliance is forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McCain. Good morning, Policy Conference. Good morning, AIPAC. Good morning, the thousands of you whose hearts contain a love of the United States of America and a love of the State of Israel. I know that in one way or another, it's those two loves being in your heart that has led you to make the commitment to be here in Washington with us this week. Each of us has our own individual story as to how those feelings have led us to make the commitment to care about this vital work. You each do individually, I do, each of us on the podium does. It's an individual story, it's a personal story that leads you to make that commitment. What is the answer for you? What is it that has led you to make the commitment to be here today? How would you answer the question if you were asked what has led you to commit to AIPAC?
For California native Betsy Burns, Sports have always been a passion.
I already grew up a big football fan. I have 3 older brothers who taught me football when I was very young.
But she never expected her pastime would become her career.
Betsy Burns is here. She's not only an avid football fan, she's also the author of the Female Fan Guide to Pro Football. Betsy, good morning.
What began as a single book about football has become a thriving business dedicated to teaching women about sports as diverse as NASCAR and horse racing.
It's helpful for women to understand mainstream sports because that's what's pop culture and that's what people are talking about.
Betsy discovered the power of sports talk when she was immersed in her other favorite pastime, pro-Israel activism.
My parents took us to Israel when I was just 10 years old. They had just finished Exodus, and I do remember thinking, wow, I'm seeing all the stuff that was in the book, and here it is in real life. And it had a huge impact on me. When I was in college, I did my senior thesis on Israel, which actually was one of my motivations to eventually work for AIPAC. So I applied for a summer internship, went to Washington, and that actually shaped the course of the rest of my life. I was so enthralled by AIPAC. That's the only thing I wanted to do after graduation was actually work for this organization. And there was an opportunity to be a field coordinator in Texas. And I really jumped at the chance to go out on my own to go speak to groups on U.S.-Israel relations. I had a little bit of a strike against me because I was from California, for one, and in my early 20s. So I started to listen to what they were talking about before I would get up to give a speech. And of course, everything in Texas was football. So I started doing my homework on high school and college football in Texas. And when I went out to give speeches, I started talking to the people beforehand about football.
But the real challenge was motivating Texans to care more about pro-Israel issues.
A lot of their issues in Texas is really agriculture. So their communities were focused on different types of issues.
Betsy traveled the Southwest and was part of a generation that cultivated pro-Israel support throughout the region.
In my home state of Texas, we have an economic cooperative agreement with Israel, which is one of the oldest state-to-state relationships in our country. Israel's success.
In the years that followed, Betsy started a family and a new business.
I never really stopped being involved with AIPAC, but I wasn't active until September 11th. And that's when I realized that AIPAC needs every single one of us. And it's one thing to sit on the sidelines like I was doing and go to the policy conferences, go to some events, but it was another thing to get back involved from an active standpoint.
So essential.
Betsy joined hundreds of other young professionals devoted to AIPAC's work and to deepening their relationships with members of Congress.
The first time I lobbied on Capitol Hill, I was petrified. But AIPAC has given me a comfort level in speaking to members of Congress.
Where do we begin?
Well, as you know, what I've come to realize is that members of Congress are just like us. And they're out there trying to get information, as much information as they can in order to make relevant decisions.
As important as AIPAC has been to Betsy's past, she also sees it as a big part of her future.
I've been involved with AIPAC now for, well, as of next year will be 20 years, which is half my life. We have to take responsibility for what's going on around the world, and AIPAC has really shown me that we can have a say. I commit to AIPAC because I don't think there's any other organization as effective in communicating the importance of a strong U.S.-Israel relationship.
Ladies and gentlemen, Betsy Burns Korn.
Hello, my name is Yossi Siegel. I'm an AIPAC board member from New York and chairman of AIPAC's Northeast region. 8 years ago, had any of us turned on our televisions to watch Meet the Press or Fox News Sunday for the latest political commentary, the chances were slim that the conversation would have centered around the Middle East week after week. Fast forward to 2008. Today, the Middle East is at the heart of many Sunday morning political roundtables, to say nothing of the dinner tables and daily thoughts of so many of us here today. From Iran's nuclear pursuits to the threat of terrorism to questions of war and peace, what takes place today in the Middle East affects American interests around the world and indeed has a global impact. Assembled here with us today is a panel of experts who are uniquely qualified to give us insights on the deeper meaning of recent events in the greater Middle East and to help us to understand what they mean for Israel, for America, and for the rest of the world. First, Ephraim Sneh. He is not only a medical doctor and a veteran of the raid on Entebbe, but also a retired general and currently a top Israeli political leader who has held a variety of cabinet-level posts, such as Minister of Health, Minister of Transportation, and Deputy Defense Minister, as well as recently starting the Strong Israel political party. Our second panelist is scholar and diplomat Dennis Ross, currently a counselor and distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy after having spent decades in high-level government positions where he played a pivotal role in shaping U.S. involvement in the peace process. Third, Liz Cheney formerly served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, where she coordinated U.S. efforts to support freedom and democracy and to expand economic and educational opportunities in the Middle East and North Africa. And last but not least on this distinguished panel is Chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, Congressman Howard Berman of California. He plays a critical role in tracking, analyzing, and shaping U.S. foreign policy. To moderate today's discussion, we turn to Dan Senor, Fox News analyst and senior adjunct fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dan, take it away.
Thank you, Yossi. Thank you. What we are going to try to do today is you will begin 72 hours of intense discussions and debate and presentations on a range of issues related to the U.S.-Israel relationship in the Middle East, is to try to provide some context by having a discussion here today with this distinguished panel going through some of these countries in the region, the big themes, the big challenges, and the big events that have been taking place over the next year and may take place over the coming year. What I want to start with is the power, the country, the government that really has so many tentacles and is spreading so much negative influence throughout the region, and that is Iran. If you really just look at the map, Lebanon, Gaza, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran's touch and reach and long arm is felt really everywhere. Just last week, the International Atomic Energy Agency issued a report raising serious questions about Iran's government not being terribly forthcoming about its pursuit of a nuclear capability and the weaponization components of that, all while Iran continues to say that it simply wants a civilian nuclear capability. And of course, Iran's support for terrorist organizations throughout the region continues to be on the minds and radar screens of policymakers, going back to the Israel-Lebanon war in 2006, where American military experts described Hezbollah's role as sort of the equivalent of a modern-day light infantry brigade of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It was that sophisticated. So we are continuing to see Iran's role spread throughout the region. And I want to start the discussion with you, Congressman Berman. Get a sense from you, what is the nature of the Iranian regime? I mean, some analysts describe it as a rogue and revolutionary regime that is purely driven by ideology, and yet others say it's much more practical than that, that in fact it's much more akin to the former Soviet Union that was ideological, yes, but also has some sort of commitment to its own national survival.
Well, thanks, Dan, and I want to answer your question, but let me just say how grateful I am to be here and to let the people here know that everything those of us who care about Israel and the U.S.-Israeli relationship do would not be possible without the incredible help, assistance, and leadership provided by AIPAC. And when you come to Washington like this, you let the Congress and the political leadership in this country know. So thank you for doing this. I'm of the belief, and I'm certainly not the greatest expert in the world, that Iran is more the latter than the former. That it is not simply a radical ideological regime for which traditional policies of leverage and pressure will have no impact. It is an opportunistic regime. It is a regime that seeks to exploit every situation that it can. It's sort of schizophrenic because in a fundamental way, Iran thinks of itself as alone in the world, and at the same time has a level, particularly as things have developed in recent years, of confidence and exuberance about its own policies. There is the internal discord that we sometimes read about. Oh, Laranjani has become the speaker. Does this mean Ahmadinejad is losing power? This has been the state of the Iranian government for many years. A great deal of internal factions, fratricidal partisanship within Iran, but a consensus continuously emerging, led by the supreme leader, but not alone, to take policies. They have shifted position 180 degrees at different times when they thought it was in their interest. So in that sense, it is more akin, in that sense, to the way the Soviet Union was in the decades before the end of the Cold War than to simply a zealous revolutionary regime for which traditional pressures and leverage can have no impact.
Dennis, let me ask you, if Howard is right, then how should that inform our thinking, our approach? I mean, if it is a priority of our government to not let Iran develop a nuclear weapon, we are clearly not making real progress on that front, or as much as we would like. Is the solution to negotiate directly with Iran?
Look, I think the key is to take a look at Iran from the following standpoint. If, in fact, leverage is going to work with them, and Howard is suggesting that, in fact, they make their decisions on a kind of cost-benefit basis, then the leverage has to be real. You could also say the inducements have to be real. I've criticized our current policy as being a policy characterized by weak sticks and weak carrots. Well, you're certainly not going to persuade them if the sticks that are used are not the kind of sticks that are going to force them to make a choice, and you're not going to induce them unless the sticks are strong enough to give them a reason to think about changing their policy. I'm of the view that there's no combination of inducements that will get them to give up nuclear weapons, because the nuclear weapons are worth more to them than the inducements. So if you want to get them to change their behavior, it isn't going to be the inducements that do it, it's going to be the sticks that focus their minds on what they stand to lose as they measure loss. Today, we are not doing that. Today, basically, the sanctions that have been applied by the Security Council don't touch the economy. Maybe you touch parts of the Revolutionary Guard, maybe you touch parts of the military, maybe you touch their nuclear industry, but you don't really touch their banks, you don't touch their commerce, you don't even touch the credit guarantees that European governments give to their companies to invest. If you want to convince the Iranians that they have to change their behavior, they have to see what they stand to lose. That's the context in which negotiations make sense. If you're going to talk about negotiations with Iran, don't go into negotiations with Iran with them thinking that they basically need it less than you do. We can't convey a message that somehow we're desperate for it, we need it more than they do. That doesn't mean you don't talk to them, but it means you create a context for the talks. And the context has to be one where they see very clearly the pressure is very real. The costs are not rhetorical costs. We don't threaten certain things and then not deliver on them. We make it clear what the costs are going to be. They begin to experience the costs. And in that context, you say, but there's also a way out. So in effect, what you're saying to them is, this isn't about humiliating you. This is about giving you a way out. But understand one thing. At the end of the day, you're going to have to make a choice. And the negotiations can only work if they realize they have to make a choice. Today, they don't think they have to make that choice.
Liz, our government has tried to talk and engage Iran directly in the past. Previous administrations have tried to do that. What has the record been in generating real progress and traction?
Well, I think it's very clear, Dan, that the record has not been a good one. And I think that what Dennis says makes a lot of sense, from an academic perspective. That is the way you ought to go into negotiations. But I think that it depends upon having a partner that you believe is a rational partner, a partner that you believe can be talked out of, in this case, nuclear weapons. And I simply don't believe that we've seen any evidence that that's the case with Iran. I think that if you look back over the history, not just of this administration, but as Senator McCain mentioned, the Clinton administration's efforts to reach out to the Iranians, there has been no shortage of efforts to talk to them, to speak with them. Madeleine Albright stood up and apologized for America's support of the Shah, for America's support of the coup, and in response, instead of the response she had been told she would get by numerous emissaries who came to the United States and said the Iranians want a warm relationship, they want to expand relations, instead, in response, the Supreme Leader stood up and said, look, the criminals have admitted the crime. So I think that if you look at the history during the Clinton administration, and if you look at our own history during this administration now, particularly since 2005, you've seen numerous efforts, both through the European Union 3, through the UN Security Council, 3 resolutions, the IAEA reporting that the Iranians are not cooperating, and the Iranians, recently announcing they're going to install 6,000 new centrifuges at Natanz. I think the lesson is clear. The only possible way that negotiations can be effective in convincing the Iranians to give up their nuclear weapons is if they believe, if they are convinced that if they don't do it diplomatically, they will face military action. It's critically important for the next president, whether it is Senator McCain, Senator Clinton, Senator Obama, to understand that we do not have the luxury of time. We don't have the luxury to have the debate we've been having about should we talk, should we not talk. The time for diplomacy here is rapidly coming to an end.
I want to bring Ephraim Sneh into this. What about hope for change within Iran from within? We often hear that there is this burgeoning reform movement that's ready to take off, and that we sort of need to figure out ways to empower those reformers, those small d Democrats, those activists within Iran to challenge the regime. From your perspective in Israel, do you see that as a path that is viable?
The reform-minded leaders in Iran, they have one common denominator. They are in jail. The reform-minded newspapers were shut down. We have to understand the problem is not the nuclear project. The problem is the regime. The regime which is based on Islamist fascism. That's the problem now. The regime must be eliminated. It's the regime that should be eliminated. Who should do it? The Iranian people. The Iranian people doesn't like this regime. Just for an example, in the recent election, 70% of the Iranians didn't show up in the voting booth. 70%. So what is possible, what is feasible, is not reforms. The regime would not allow reforms, but it can be forced out. It can be toppled by the people. It's feasible. But there are 2 preconditions in order to accelerate it. One, real effective sanctions. Sanctions that would make it impossible for the regime to govern, to run the economy, to feed 70 million hungry people. This is one thing. The second, to stop the pilgrimage, to stop the courting, appeasing the regime. The Iranian people interpret all the incentives, all the carrots that are offered to the mullahs as a sign that the Western democracies do not want that this regime will be toppled, because they court him all the time. This must be stopped.
Howard Berman, what do you see sanctions as the solution here? What kind of results have they generated thus far?
I think it's very important for everyone to understand a couple of things. Number one, our current policy is not working. Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons capability at a much faster rate than our sanctions policy is creating pressures on them to change behavior. More than half of the trade with Iran is done by European countries, Japan and Australia. Russia and China have consistently undercut efforts at the Security Council to get tougher sanctions. I do believe there is a level of sanctions that could cause Iran to change its behavior. And the question is, and I think it'll be the challenge for the next administration, is what is the process by which we achieve the willingness of these countries to get those sanctions? No one thinks, I would hope that no one thinks simply talking to Iran because we want to be talking to Iran is going to produce what we want. You have to have a strategy. But right now, I don't believe we have a strategy that's working to achieve the goal that I think there's tremendous bipartisan consensus we need to achieve here. Iran cannot have nuclear weapons capability.
I want to move to another flashpoint in the region, which is Lebanon really in Syria. And if you look at the 25-year arc, if you will, that began in 1983 with the Hezbollah bombings of the U.S. Marines and our diplomats there that killed some 260 Americans, and you look at that 25-year period that really sort of ends in the last month, where you saw Hezbollah successfully taking over about half of Beirut. Huge setback for the Senor government in Lebanon, huge setbacks for our allies in Lebanon, and enormous implications for the region. Liz, just a couple of years ago in 2005, we were celebrating the Cedar Revolution, this uprising, this anti-Syrian uprising, anti-Hezbollah uprising in the streets of Beirut. What has happened to that revolution, and what are the implications for this dramatic setback for Israel, for the United States, and for our friends in the region?
Well, I think what's happened to the Cedar Revolution is heartbreaking. I think that you have a situation in which a whole series of factors, including Israel's inability and willingness to do what was necessary in 2006 to fundamentally deal a blow to Hezbollah. The perception that Hezbollah, by surviving the war in that summer, won, I think has caused a real blow to Israel's credibility, to America's credibility in the region, because there is a sense there that Hezbollah was able to stand up to Israel. I think that America has also made mistakes over the course of the last several years. And I think that the extent to which Syria has felt that it could operate with impunity, at least until the Israeli airstrike to take out their nuclear plant, for which I think Israel should be congratulated. But I think the story of Lebanon tells you the extent to which everything in the region is intertwined. The perception of the United States in the Middle East matters hugely. And I think it's very important, as we are now in this election year, that the candidates take the right lessons from this administration. And in my view, this administration has gotten it right when we have been bold, when we have been decisive, when we have been focused, when we have used our military force when necessary. Where we have been less effective and less successful is when we have been, unfortunately, not so bold, when we have not held Bashar Assad to account for the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, for the killing of American soldiers inside Iraq, for his support to Hezbollah, for the killing of Israelis that he has funded and supported through his support of Hezbollah. And I think that getting back to a situation where our enemies in the region understand that America will stand up for its friends, that America will stand up for its principles, and that we have red lines is critically important, because when those red lines aren't there, when our enemies like Iran and Syria begin to believe that they can act with impunity, you see situations like you've got in Lebanon today, where Hezbollah now has a veto over that government, where Hezbollah will be able, I fear, to significantly continue its efforts to rearm in southern Lebanon, continue to threaten Israel, and allow Iran a real chokehold on the region.
You know, Dennis, there's an interview by the head of Israeli military intelligence in Haaretz last week where he said that if Israel has to face Hezbollah again, Hezbollah will literally be able to launch rockets from both north and south of the Litani River. More rockets believed in Hezbollah's hands today than the 13,000 that they had before the last Lebanon war. And it seems, as Liz was alluding to, Syria is a key linchpin in all of this. And yet Syria seems to have its own sort of Jekyll and Hyde personality. At times they seem to want to participate in some sort of constructive process, and at other times they seem to be doing Iran's dirty work and providing support to Hezbollah. How should the United States and Israel, for that matter, view Syria as a potential partner or permanent enemy?
Well, I think what we see going on with the Israelis right now is a desire to at least test what the answer is. They're not presuming they know what the answer is, they're testing what the answer is. Those in the Israeli military for the last couple of years have favored a dialogue with the Syrians for several reasons. Number one, they thought they might be at war with Syria, and they decided, well, if we talk to them, let's see if there's a way to avert that. Two, they said, look, they don't really ideologically believe and share the Islamist agenda of the Iranians or Hezbollah. Maybe we can wean them away, and if we do, we basically transform the region from a strategic standpoint. I don't think they go into it with a set of illusions that by talking to the Syrians, they necessarily presume they know that the Syrians are going to change behavior, but they want to test and see whether it's possible. I think there's a certain logic to that, but I'd like to get to something that Liz raised, because I think the larger issue is less Syria and it's more Iran. Certainly, if you could wean the Syrians away from the Iranians, it sends a message to the region, a psychological message. The Iranians are basically saying, along with Hezbollah and Hamas, that there is a different narrative now for this part of the world. Dating from the Madrid conference, there was a sense that when it comes to peace, there'll be peace and there'll be a two-state solution. Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas say no. You don't have to accept that narrative. So if Syria actually is not joining with them, it sends a message that maybe they don't think that this narrative is inevitable after all. But again, the real culprit in the end is Iran, far more than Syria. Syria becomes a conduit through which weapons go. The fact is, before the last war, Hezbollah had about 17,000 rockets. Now, after the war, maybe they were down to around 10,000 rockets. Today, they're somewhere between 30 and 40,000 rockets, even though there was a Security Council resolution that the administration touted very highly, 1701, in which they weren't supposed to be rearmed, but they were. Liz made the point about red lines. Well, that should have been a red line, but it wasn't. When the head of Israeli military intelligence says that they're capable of firing rockets from above the Litani and below the Litani, UNIFIL, the UNIFIL, which was supposed to be robust, big, 15,000 on the one hand, and then 15,000 from the Lebanese army, all deployed below the Litani River, and at least the one achievement was, even if you didn't prevent the rearming of Hezbollah, at least Hezbollah wouldn't have rockets below the Litani, and guess what? They now have rockets below the Litani. So if we're going to establish certain positions and we're not going to stand by them, we have a real fundamental problem. One of the senior members of the administration at one point said we stopped drawing red lines vis-a-vis Iran because they kept stepping over them. Well, I hate to tell you, then they weren't red lines. And at some point, if you're going to change the behavior of the Iranians, if you're going to change the behavior of the Syrians, if you're going to send a message to Hezbollah they have a lot to lose, when you establish a red line, it better be red and not pink.
Go ahead, Liz.
I just want to make one point quickly, because I agree with what Dennis said, and I know we're nonpartisan here, but this is a fundamentally important issue in this election. And it's fundamentally important because what I fear is that you have a situation where particularly Senator Clinton and Senator Obama are taking those lessons from this administration and attempting to do more of the things we have done that have been mistakes. You do not hear from them. You don't hear from either one of them, frankly, the kind of thing that you're hearing from Dennis right now, which is red lines must be red lines. And at the end of the day, the United Nations cannot enforce red lines, the European Union 3 cannot enforce red lines, only the United States of America, with the threat of our military power and capability, can enforce those red lines.
The good thing is that we're friends and we have these discussions. I would just make one point. I agree you have to enforce red lines. But maybe one area where we have a slight difference is that you have to pick and choose your moments to think about how you use negotiations. One value of negotiations isn't always because you expect that they are going to produce the results you want, although you hope they will. They also create a context in which it's a lot easier to press others to do more. When you make your unwillingness to talk the focal point, you shift the attention away from the bad behavior that you want to change. Our challenge is to frame issues in a way that gets the rest of the world to understand what's at stake, to see we're not the problem